Hi, everybody. I'm Ash Baker. If you haven't met me, I work for Foundations of Success. So this presentation and exercise was pulled together for you by Leander Lacey, Sheila O'Connor, and Caroline Sten, as well as myself. But as you'll hear from Caroline in a moment, this was a very broad effort overall. So we'll get there soon, but just acknowledging that. So we have a quick presentation for you all to overview what the updates were to the conservation standards for this version. We'll have some time for clarifying questions there as well. Then we'll have an opportunity for people to get a little bit more acquainted on a little tour where folks will be able to jump around and actually visit with some of the new updates. We'll give some detailed instructions on that once we get there. And then we'll share a little bit out from that breakout group exercise, and then we'll wrap up and see how folks might want to get involved. So we're going to hop over into the presentation now. And for that, Caroline, you'll take it from here.
You're on mute,
But you're on mute.
Caroline.
God, such a rookie mistake. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for joining the call. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the process that we use to update 5.0, as well as get into some of the technical details of that update. Before going too far, though, I want to just get all on the same page about how we define the conservation standards. So there's the core document. You will probably recognize this, CS 4.0, and that has all the high level practices and principles. But it doesn't have all the detail about how do you actually take these high level practices and principles and put them into operation. And that detail and support comes through things like frameworks, the threats and actions classification, or a whole suite. We have a lot of how-to guides out there and case studies, examples, IT solutions like Mirati or Miro. And then also a lot of this, but not enough. There's always more we can do and should do to get these materials out in various languages. So all of this together is really what we need to operationalize the conservation standards. But this update was more focused on the core document itself. So the process goes all the way back to October 2023 at the CMP members retreat, where the group there identified some initial key themes and they agreed on the overall process. And then in the coming months, even a little before April, we were getting broader CS community input on those themes. And then we started forming working groups around those themes and identifying leaders. And then those working groups went off and spent a lot of time looking at what was already in 4.0 and then gathering information, agreeing on what sort of updates they wanted to make, and then drafting some initial text. Toward the end of the year, we pulled all that together and synthesized it a bit, and then gave the opportunity for these working groups and theme leads to look at one another's input and then react to it. We revised and updated so everything was kind of aligned and shared it with CMP, got comments from the reps from CMP, and then moved into final production, some copy edit as well as layout. And then we launched it at the rally in March this year. So now we're at this point and we are actively starting up translations. So that's great. And I'll be sending out messages about this to the broader community. And we are also, ideally, we would like to be working on updating kind of that broader suite of stuff that I mentioned, not just the core document, but some of the guidance and frameworks and that sort of stuff. And that is something that the working groups talked about and they were interested in doing it, but we're taking a little breather after all of this hard work, but we do hope to get back to this. So just want to acknowledge all the folks involved, all the pictures you see up here. These folks led at least one, led or co-led at least one theme, and they were even involved in other themes. So it was really fantastic. A lot of people involved in leading, and I helped support the coordination overall. But I do want to really say none of this would have been possible without these people. We had so many individuals involved across multiple themes, giving a lot of their time and energy to this, and a lot of separate institutions as well. So I'm super excited about that. I really feel like this is a product that reflects the community input. And so, yeah, it's great. And hopefully you'll feel the same. So now on to some of the main updates. So the first one is related to terminology, and these green oval, or the ovals in general, are what we used to call targets. We are now calling them focal values. Many of you may be aware that this targets is a term we struggled with for a long time, but never really came up with a better option. But it was starting to get to the point where we're interacting with people that are outside of our community, and they use targets in a very different way. And so focal values is what we ultimately came, or what this group came to propose for those ovals. So you can have biodiversity focal values, human well-being, cultural, climate, and there's more detail about that in the standards. What is now what we're calling target is more synonymous or more analogous with what the rest of the community calls target, or conservation community. So it's really the value, the quantitative or qualitative thing that you're ultimately aiming for in a goal or an objective statement. It's where you want to get. It's not the whole statement itself, but it's the value here. It might be a number, it might be a range, it might be something more qualitative. The yellow hexagon, what we used to call strategy, is now an action. And if you think about the conservation actions classification, that kind of makes sense. But what we were calling a strategy, we're now thinking of is this whole thing. It's not just, it's the action, and it might be one or more actions, but it's also the results we expect to see from those actions, the activities we need to implement them. It's the whole, essentially, results chain is the strategy. And then the last thing is we've replaced the word stakeholder throughout with interested parties. This was a recommendation from our equitable conservation group, and we'll talk about that group's work in just a moment. But this was really to reflect the fact that stakeholder, it can have some negative connotations, and a much more neutral term is interested parties. So now the equitable conservation group. This group defined equitable conservation in terms of, well, as conservation work that intentionally and holistically incorporates the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. In the glossary, as you can see in the background here, there are detailed definitions of each of these components, as well as other terms or concepts related to equitable conservation. Throughout the document, this group refined the language and made sure that we were integrating equitable or principles of equitable conservation. And there's also a bit more detail and discussion about the need for social safeguards. There was a group working on human well-being, and they closely collaborated with the equitable conservation group because there was a lot of overlap. This group brought forward a lot of some more details and examples, some of which was already in the human well-being guidance, but it was not apparent that that was part of our guidance. It wasn't reflected in the higher level practices and principles. And the group thought it was really important to bring some of that forward. They clarified that human well-being may be equal and or independent, that there are more maybe more direct relationships. So you can see the arrows going directly back and forth here, as well as in this particular example, showing how a threat might directly affect a conservation target, biodiversity focal value, as well as a human well-being focal value through a different path. So there's just kind of more recognition of the multiple relationships there. And this is another diagram, a new figure in the conservation standards that also recognizes that. There were groups working on steps 3 as well as 4 and 5. And in step 3, there is right at the beginning of it, a reminder to go back and revisit your project team and structure. It makes sense now that you're at a point that you're moving into implementation, just to make sure you've got the right team. You also making sure at that point that you're setting up the structures for tracking and reporting. So when you get to the step 4, analyze and adapt, you're prepared to do that. There's references to pause and reflect processes as a standard practice, and more details and examples of what that process might look like. And then there's a tighter connection among these steps as well as with earlier ones. Evidence and scaling didn't have a ton of updates, but there was just kind of additional emphasis and integration of those concepts. And related to, this is just an example of how the equitable conservation group edits and suggestions came through in multiple places, recognizing that evidence comes from many sources. So this could include traditional ecological knowledge. So kind of making those things that a lot of us know much more explicit at the level of the standards. There was a group that worked to clarify how the conservation standards relate to other frameworks. This is a section we had in CS 4.0, but what this group did was give it a really nice structure and group things so that they identified that there are organizational or audience-based adaptations of the conservation standards. So things like WWF's project and program management standards, or TNC's conservation by design, or healthy country planning process. All of those build on but adapt the conservation standards so that they work better with their audiences. There are other frameworks that are focused on adaptive management, and so things like the collective impact framework or conservation planning specialist groups, principles and steps. So those are just other ways of doing adaptive management. There are a lot of different tools out there that maybe we don't typically use. A lot of us don't use in our CS toolbox, but they can be quite helpful for implementing the conservation standards. So things like consequence tables or systems maps. And then there are other standards out there that things like the green list of protected areas. All right, there was a group working on behavior change. And so we all know that conservation is very much a behavior change endeavor, but they worked to make that much more explicit in the conservation standards. They identified different levers or levers for influencing behavior. And throughout, they integrated the connections to behavior. There was a group working on spatial and technology updates, and they also integrated a lot of their ideas throughout the steps and showed how those various technologies can support different steps. They clarified a bit some of the benefits and challenges with the different technologies. And they've also developed some supplemental materials that are where there's a detailed table that has information on where each of the conservation standard steps and what geospatial approaches might make sense. And one thing to note here is this group was not the only group that had supplemental materials. What came through in this whole update process was that a lot of groups had so much information they wanted to share. And I had to keep saying, we got to keep this to the high level practices and principles. And we needed a space to put that material. It's not necessarily fully formed guidance, but it's still really useful material that can help support teams as they're working on these different themes. So we developed a supplemental brief, and that's linked in the overview, I believe, of the conservation standards. And it's very much a work in progress. Some teams have not had the chance to put their materials in there yet. Some have put their materials, but they're adding more stuff. So this is just kind of a little bit of a space where we can link users out to more information that will evolve over time. Climate change. So in previous versions, the last couple of versions of the conservation standards, we've had these green boxes, climate change considerations, and we've continued with those. And there are figures also, and those provide examples of how you can integrate climate change or take that into account at various points in the conservation standards process. The emphasis in previous versions was on climate resilience and adaptation. So thinking about what are the impacts of climate change and how can we help adapt or adjust things based on those impacts. But this version of the conservation standards has a bit more, or I guess it includes explicit text around climate mitigation for projects whose primary aim is to avoid, reduce, or sequester greenhouse gas emissions. And this is new. The rest of this was updated and refined. And then I think the last point here is just the look and feel. This is the first time we've ever had somebody, a designer, work on the layout, and so CMP put some funds toward this, recognizing really that this is our flagship product and we wanted it to look really nice and professional. So it's well, you can check it out, but I think it looks a lot nicer. I've heard from people that they really like the look and feel of it. But one of the things that people like a lot is over here, this navigation bar, where it just makes it easier to jump around. This is a screenshot, so you can't see, but I could click on assess and go right up to the assess step or down to implement or anywhere that I want to go in the document more quickly. So hopefully that makes it easier to navigate.
And so the intention now is to, I think, have the tour guides give a kind of report out back to us in terms of some of the things that they heard in their group. So maybe what I'll do is I'll go through the list that I had on my sheet, and then Caroline, you can tell me if I've missed anyone or anything.
Sure.
When we will start with equitable conservation. That's the first on my list. Adrienne, are you comfortable going through the notes that you took?
I'm so comfortable. I got so distracted by our wonderful conversation that I forgot to take notes, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Great.
So a couple of key things that came up in our first group. We talked a lot about the change to using interested parties and why we moved away from stakeholders and how it's important to understand the context of your team. So that stakeholder terminology is particularly problematic in the North American context. But teams globally may still use the stakeholder term, and that's okay as long as you all sort of know what you're doing and know that, especially in North America, that stakeholder probably is not going to work for you. I think that was most of the conversation in the first one. Jump in if I'm wrong, but the second group, we started off actually talking jumping in with a tough question from John about how to solve racism. Um, and talking about sort of the higher level, the guidance and where to find, so how we're approaching DEIJ and why we decided to include that, even though again in the North American context, we recognize that can be kind of problematic right now, and so for funding reasons, you might be forced to not talk about it in that language using that terminology. But because CMP is a global community, and CS 5.0 is intended to reach that global community, we did not want to shy away from using terminology just because of current political situations in particular places. And so we went ahead and did it anyway. And for more specific guidance, we really want to keep this working group alive. And so we want to be able to provide you with more tools on how to implement some of the recommendations that we put into CS 5.0. That work is still ongoing. So if you're interested in participating, please let Leander in particular know, but you can email me too. And I'm just going to put in a link to some guidance that Leander put together, guidance, some high-level questions for teams that are interested in this kind of work that they might want to like think through before they engage in a conservation project that I think everyone might find useful. I think that was it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that there was some high-level discussion about culture change at organizations, right? That this sort of guidance document really can't help you with, unfortunately, is how you change culture to be more inclusive and equitable, et cetera. And so that's something I think that'll be an organization by organization discussion about how you all think about integrating some of this equitable conservation into your agency or organization. I think next is step 3.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to step in as facilitator and note that we're at the hour. So if you could be succinct in your readouts, that would be great. It looks like we still have a lot of CMP business to get through, including an ICCB debrief. So thank you for your pithy responses.
Thank you, Daphne.
Hi, everybody. So I was running the step 3 group until my internet dropped out and I lost everybody. So apologies for that. We just went through the main changes into step 3, which is shown there on that slide. And then the main conversation was around how it would be really handy to have examples of step 3 documentation. So work plans and budgets, team charters, that kind of thing, that we could share with people. So I might just put a quick call out if anyone's has examples of that sort of thing that they're happy to share. I'd love to get them. And then, as Caroline mentioned, we're trying to set up more guidance sort of resource. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Annette. Steps 4 through 5.
Yeah, so the biggest things we talked about were the need for guidance now for steps 4 through 5. So we did talk about the Pause and Reflect toolkit that's existing. There's a new link in there for folks who might be looking for it and don't have access to it anymore. There's also a suggestion to develop guidance for Pause and Reflect at a program level and looking at scale. So hopefully the working group can tackle that. And then some interesting thoughts about the intersection of equitable conservation with these steps and everything else, honestly, in the conservation standards. So that's it.
Thank you, Ash. Other adaptive management approaches?
Our team discussed the big world of other frameworks, other tools, other systems that exist elsewhere. And the bulk of our conversation really centered around a spreadsheet that I've just popped into the chat, which has a consolidated list of the other things that we found out there and how they relate to the conservation standards or not. And we really spoke about some minor sort of tweaks and changes we made to that spreadsheet, but how important it is for us to sort of stay aligned with what else is out there. And before we ended off, David was talking about other international standards beyond the conservation sector as well, so that we might, obviously, things like finance that we might need to sort of be cognizant of within our conservation work as well. So have a look at that spreadsheet if you haven't already.
Thank you, Claire. Just 3 more. So we have climate, and then human well-being, and then the miscellaneous.
So on climate, folks were happy to see the addition of some sort of high level, I don't want to say guidance, but high level advice on how to address climate mitigation. And I mentioned that I'm going to be working on I am starting to work on a guidance document on that. John suggested really addressing the tension and trade-offs between the need to increase renewable energy in order to decrease the threat of climate change to the places that we love, and the fact that that actually threatens the places that we love, and need to really face that and recognize it. So next steps, I'm working on this mitigation guidance piece, and Catherine and I are going to talk about how to incorporate climate into her wonderful courses.
Fantastic. Thank you. Human well-being.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Overall, had a lot of great feedback on the new revisions to human well-being and how it's been reflected in the updated document. So that's great. I had some questions from people about the actions classification that I think is still undergoing revision, and if there's going to be any more focus on actions related to human well-being specifically, as opposed to that more biodiversity focal value. So I don't actually know the answer to that. Maybe someone does, or we can touch on it later.
Yep. I can answer that very quickly.
Amazing.
The actions classification is still in development, but we are hoping to publish it in the next few months. So we're getting there. And yes, there's more emphasis on the human well-being and sort of One Health approach as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that update. Another question about, are we able to do more complex threat ratings and stress ratings with human well-being targets in Marathi? I don't really think you can, but I can pause if anyone knows the answer to that. And then also just generally some folks who are interested in helping out with the revisions to the more specific human well-being guidance that was done in 2016. So I'll connect with Caroline after this and we can send out a note to anyone who may be interested. I'll resume those working groups in the next couple of weeks. So thanks, everyone.
Nice. And then Caroline, and if you also wanted to, you can take over from here as well, Caroline, if you'd like.
Okay. Yep. Just quickly, we talked about a lot of different things since we were a grab bag, but the thing that kept coming up was terminology. And so we just spent a fair amount of time in the glossary and looking at alternative terms and the way that we arrived at the terms. And so anyway, I think that's probably enough for now. Oh, and thank you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline is highlighting something that I did share with my team. Make sure you always, when you're looking at the conservation standards, I would recommend it at least in the next few months to always check back to the conservation standards website for the latest version, because we're finding little small updates that we need to make and we'll be replacing it. So always check back, please.
Okay. The last thing we wanted to do here was just this wrap up. Thank you everybody for going on that tour with us. Please feel free to keep adding notes and questions there as well. I can't guarantee we'll all go back and answer them, but it would be great to see what people are wondering about still. But we do have a couple ways that, well, one main way that folks could still be involved. I think a lot of people identified desire for future guidance or more work. There are some of the working groups that we were in to rewrite the standards and to work on the standards. They have still been meeting, so you can see that some of these groups are still active, and they may or may not be working on guidance. They might just be working on brainstorming or small documents here and there. But we are hoping for some of these groups for us to continue to be working groups and work on guidance. I know for the step 4 and 5 group, that's something that is true. And I think for these others as well. So if you're interested in staying involved and being involved in some of these groups, feel free to add your name to this slide and say which groups so that the folks can contact you. And then I'll just say the CS 5.0 supplemental materials link. Caroline mentioned it in her overview. There's some more details that, maybe they were a little bit too verbose or long to actually fit in the standards, or maybe they skewed more towards guidance than principles. So we put them into this supplemental theme materials document, and that will continue to be updated by the groups as they work together. That might evolve into a different space, but for now, that's somewhere you can go and find out really everything, all of the great work people did that maybe didn't end up in the standards themselves, but is still important for us to refer to if a theme or topic is of interest to you. So you can find more at that link. We'll be updating it. And yeah, that is, I think, it for us. Yeah, great to see some names added there.
Thank you. That was really great. What an enormous amount of work. So thank you to everyone who worked on that. And thank you for taking the time to walk us through. Really helpful.